Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 156. We are concluding the month of Adar, entering Mismar Geula Legeula, as the Gemara says, from one redemption to the next, the redemption Geula of Purim to the Geula of Nisan, Chodesh HaGeula. Called the whole month is called Geula. This is the Geula of Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is of course a Pula Nimshachas, has a perpetual impact, as the Maral brings and explains that Yetzias Mitzrayim, when the Jews left Egypt, which is over 3,200 years ago, 3229 to be exact, they established and received the status of a Ben Chedin, which means that they never again can be enslaved. Because slavery is not just a physical thing, a physical bondage, it's a spiritual thing, it's a mindset, it's a psychological state. Yetzias Mitzrayim introduced the concept of freedom to mortals, that you're my God's servants, not servants to my servants. And that became a permanent feature in the Jewish people, and from that you can extend to all human beings, being by virtue of the fact that we're created in the divine image. So we are entering in this month the Chodesh HaGeula, and I specifically spelled it out in terms of Chassidus Applied, the psychological impact of that it's really knowing that you can redeem yourself from any given situation, for any Mitzrayim in your life, whether it's personal or collective, whether it's emotional or psychological, whether it's imagined or real, any type of constraint, Mitzrayim from the word constraint, inhibition, any fears, all of that is what this month that we're entering in is all about. And of course, in 2 weeks, will be the 2 weeks from Rosh Chodesh Nisan comes the 15th of Nisan, which is the actual date of when we celebrate Pesach, which also means transcendence. Pesach, to leap over. So let me share a few words about the period, the exact period we're in, which, as I said, we're going into Rosh Chodesh Nisan. This was also the Parsha of Vayikra. Next Shabbos will be Vayikra Hey Nisan, and this week also has Beis Nisan in it, which is close to us, in the context of the Rebbe Rashab's Yortzeit Istalkus, Beis Nisan Tov Reish Pei, in the year 1920, when the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, was nostalgic, and the Frierdiker Rebbe immediately, his Ben Yochid, his only son, only child, assumed the leadership. All documented in Ashkafta the Rebbe, something I've already cited and discussed in previous years regarding this date. So I won't go over that, but there you can have a very detailed, emotional, and extremely relive, as if it's happening right now, an experience that happened those many years ago. We're talking now almost 100 years, 1920, we go over in the year 2017, or Tov Reish Pei, and we're now in Tov Shinai Zayin. So it's exactly 97 years ago. So there he describes in details, and which I will cite one or two of them in a moment. So we're going to the month of Nisan, and as I said, it's Parsha Vayikra. So what better place to turn to is a sikha from the Rebbe himself. 30 years ago, exactly 30 years ago, the same kviyus as this year. So 30 years ago, Tov Shem Mem Zayin, Beis Nisan was also this week, and Shabbos Vayikra was Hey Nisan. And that kviyus is also the kviyus when the Rebbe's year, the Rebbe was born. Because the Rebbe was born on a Friday. Yud Aleph Nisan this year will also be on a Friday. We'll talk about that next week. And as such, the Rebbe in the Sikh in Vayikra Tov Shem Mem Zayin, it's a Mugadik Sikh, and it's one of the rare times that the Rebbe actually wrote a compliment in how the Sikh was prepared. And I must say, with all humility, that this is a Sikh I had the schus to prepare. The only time we received a compliment. Actually, that year, the Rebbe also, as you know, the Sikhs were edited. The Rebbe would edit, at that point, he was editing almost every week, the Shabbos Farbrengen, in addition to the Likutei Sikhs that would come out, which was a likut, a collection of previous year's talks, whether it was a Rashi or a Rambam or other ideas. And that year they prepared a likut, but the Rebbe said to take this sikha and translate it for the Likutei Sikhs of that week. So it came out both in the original, as we prepared it in Yiddish, and they translated it into Hebrew. So if you look at Sefer HaSichos Tov Shem Mem Zayin, it's a very powerful sikha. I've cited it a number of times on MyLife, due to its relevance, not just this week, but its relevance in general, because it talks about what a Nasi is, what a leader, what a Rebbe is, and most importantly, the nitzchis of a Nasi. And it begins with, obviously, as soon as we begin Rosh Chodesh Nisan, we also begin the minig of saying the Nasi for each day. So the first 12 days of Nisan, we say the Esteem, the Nasi of each day. And the Rebbe talks about that, why we say the Nasi of each day, which is taken from Parsha Nasi, where it talks about what each Nasi did, what each Nasi was brought or the offerings they brought in the Chanukas HaMizbeach, and the Chanukas HaMishkan, I should say, the dedication of the temple, the sanctuary in the portable sanctuary when they traveled through the wilderness. And I'm not going to go over the entire Sikha. It's something I would suggest everyone read, especially coming into this coming Shabbos. Very powerful, very relevant in the Nitzchis. And the Rebbe goes into the discussion, what is the significance of saying the Nasi? Connecting it to Beis Nisan, the Nesius of the Frierdiker Rebbe is beginning as the Stalkus of the Rebbe Rashab, as the sun set, the sun rose. The new sun rose, sun as an S-U-N, Zorach HaShemesh or Bo HaShemesh, and more details connected, which of course we know, Yud Aleph Nisan, the Rebbe's birthday, is also within this Nesim, Nasi L'Bnei Osher, the Nasi of Osher, of the Shevet Osher. And in this Sikha, the Rebbe speaks about essentially the Nitzchis of a Nasi, and that's why we say it, because we connect to the Nasi as the Moshe Rabbeinu of each generation, the leader, representing what Hashem wants us to accomplish in each generation, respective generation. And therefore the Nasi represents essentially what is the mission that Hashem gives each nation, through each generation, through its leader. And he cites here a Maimer, the first Maimer that the Frierdiker Rebbe said, which was said exactly at the end of Shiva for his father, which was Shabbos Pashat Tzav after Mincha, he said this Maimer. As a matter of fact, the Maimer is one that was said, that the Frierdiker Rebbe had to say it because the Rebbe Rashab told him to say it, but he didn't want to say it in public, so he called in Rabbi Rifkin. He says, since my father told me I have to say it, so I'm saying it to you. Rabbi Rifkin opened the door and told Chassidim, and they listened into this Maimer. So today she's going on Molek, which is the last Maimer that the Rebbe Rashab said, because remember, this is the period of time, Parsha Zocher, Purim, Beis Nisan came right after those days, and obviously the period in time they were in then was in the hells of the beginning of the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union, which would only get more intense and more difficult. So Amalek was a very real presence in Jewish life in general, in that world, in the Russia, and especially in the world of the Rabbeim. And there are many stories about that last Purim Tafresh Pei, which again here is not the place to talk about. But in this Maimer, so the Rebbe quotes in the Sikha, he says these words: "Umokem haTeira v'Aveda shel Tzadik b'Kedushosei hu gam la'achli aleisei mechaye hagufis l'chaim ha'amitim v'oras eir Avedasa nishir b'mkeimei." Short, briefly translated, the Mokem, the place of Teira and Aveda of the Tzadik, remains in its Kedushosei, in its sanctity and its holiness, also after, including after when he leaves the life of this physical world to the life of to the true life. But the ha'aras eir avedase, a reflection of the energy of the light of his aveda, remains b'mkeimeh. V'diyashlemer sha'mokim shaboy lomad. Yashlemer, that the place where he learned v'osak b'teira and toiled or exerted in teira, v'chol kelov sheishtamish behem l'tzorchei aveda, and all the containers and all the vessels and all the furniture, all the physical things that he worked with for his Aveda, Kedushase Aleim Mechelkei Birurei Be'elam. The Kedushase reigns, hovers above them, or hovers within them, Kedushase Aleim, from all, because that was part of the section of his refinement, the refinements, the Birurim of his in this world. And then he brings a story. This is all, I'm actually citing literally the Sikha from Vayikra Mem Zayin 30 years ago, which in turn is citing from the Maimer connected to Beis Nisan, the first Maimer the Frierdiker Rebbe said. And he brings a story about his father, the Rebbe Rashab, Rebbe Nishma Seid. The Frierdiker Rebbe brings a story about the Frierdiker Rebbe's father, who had just passed away. And he says, I once saw my father enter the cheder, the room, where my grandfather, the Rebbe Marash, where he would, with his cheder yechidus, his kedush kadashim. And it was right after the passing. The Rebbe Marash passed away in Tov Mem Gimel. Remember, the Frierdiker Rebbe was born in Tov Mem. So he was 3 years old when the Rebbe Marash passed away. So he says this happened by Erech Shnas Mem Hey or Mem Vov. So Frierdiker Rebbe in this story would have been 5 or 6 years old. So he sees his father going to the room of the Rebbe Marash, and the order, the Sidrei HaCheder, were the same way they were still set up, the way it was set up in the time of the Rebbe Marash. V'nichnas lovush b'chagura, my father, the Rebbe Nishma, saying the Rebbe Rashab, whose stalkus is on Beis Nisan, was dressed up b'chagura with his gartel, meaning in a formal way, all dressed up. V'omad eitzel hashulchan, he stood near the table, lemul kisei shiftei, across this chair where the Rebbe Marash would sit, v'sfasav noyes kemedaber, and his lips moved like he was speaking. Ubocha harbe, and he cried, increasingly cried. He cried a lot, basically. And the Rebbe continues to explain, based on the Maimer, because why is he bringing this story? Because this story shows that even the shulchan, the table, and the physical room, and the chair where the Rebbe Marash was still alive. And that's why the Rebbe Rashab went in there, as if he went in, the Friedrich Rebbe Rashab went in, even though it was already Achri Aleisei Mechaya Hagufis, the Rebbe Marash. And the Rebbe explains, based on the Maimer, the idea that Nitzchias, explained for the Maimer, that the Kelim of Atzilus, Esses Viz the Gdusha, but the Kelim become one with the Eir, because they're bottled to the Eir, and the Farham, the Kelim are Kiyum Atzmei, they have a Kiyum Atzmei, a core, fundamental, essential sustenance and permanence that they endure, which they receive from the Eir. And explains it more up Chassidus if you look in the footnotes and so on. And then he continues more of the elaboration and essentially captures the essence of what the Nesius is, what Nesiim are, and the Nasi, that a Nasi presence in this world remains intact even if physically he's not here. So you can understand the relevance of this to us today after Gimel Tammuz, though the Sikha was said a number of years before that. Nevertheless, the Sikha itself is also eternal, obviously. And as I said, the Sikha captures the whole essence of what we are about, that things do not die, God forbid. Everything lives on, even in the most physical way. In the previous weeks, we talked at length, 9 parts I talked about, the Rishimu, that impression or trace, that even after the Tzimtzum Arishin, which is that Tzimtzum we know b'derech Silu, complete concealment, utter concealment. But since Gedusha Le'ezazimim came, a holiness never leaves, there has to remain a Rishimu, some impression afterwards. And the Rishimu is the Sheresh HaKelim, is the root of the Kelim. So here's a very practical application of the idea with the Rebbe Marash is Machadish, Rebbe Marash, Le'noga b'mat Tzimtzum, that the Asius HaRishimu, Le'noga b'mat Tzimtzum never impacted them. That's why they remain intact. Which tells us that no matter what the concealment may be like, even a Gimel Tammuz concealment, even utter concealment that to our eyes of flesh and blood we cannot see through the behind the curtain, but fundamentally the Kedusha remains. And how do we access it? By learning what the Rebbe learns, by living the way the Rebbe wants us to live, by following in the paths and direction that we were trained and we were taught. And that continues, and that brings alive that which is already alive, which is the Nitzchi, the Kiyam Nitzchi, even in the Kelim, the Gashmis, the Kelim and the Gashmis, of where the Rebbe spent his time, where he learned and davened, and for so many years. So the lesson is quite obvious. Vayikra, 30 years ago, same Kvias, leading to Yud Aleph Nisan, coming from Beis Nisan, and it all comes together in this powerful lesson of Nitzchis and eternity, which of course gives us all strength, knowing, just like this, when we talk about the Kesla Marovi, the Western Wall, the Gedusha Le'ezazimim came, that the Eibishter miraculously kept it, that it lasted through all the wars and all the trials and tribulations and all the exiles and all the destructions, and still one wall remains, was a sign of Gedusha Le'ezazimim came to remind us that things do not disappear, to tell us there's a lot more that we don't see, but here we visibly see it. So there's a strength in that, which also applies if you think about it personally, when you know that no matter what you've gone through in your personal life, even if you've gone through a personal Holocaust, or a loss, or a death, God forbid, or other challenges that we all endure, know that there's a part that never disappears. The pilot flame always remains burning. You may not always feel it. You may sometimes feel it's hopeless. You may sometimes feel resigned. But know and know well that that's exactly why we say the Nesiim, is because there is something, the pilot flame remains burning. It's our challenge is to access it and fan those flames and bring them alive into our personal lives. But never ever for one moment think that we have been abandoned, God forbid, or forsaken. the Kedusha remains, the Rebbe remains, the power remains, and Leizazim Kema, exactly as it was before. It's only our limited eyes, our limited experiences, and our sensory tools that simply cannot see or hear or touch, taste, and smell things that are of a higher caliber, a more ethereal presence. So we have our lesson, a lesson on a personal level, on a collective level, and very appropriate to this period in time which we are right now. Okay. With that, let us go into a few questions that were asked. And the questions keep coming, so I encourage you all to please submit your questions or comments or feedback at meaningfullife.com/MyLife. There's a forum there that you can easily just fill in, ask your question, and it's totally and utterly anonymous if you wish it to be. Meaning, don't do anything and it's anonymous. If you want us to know who you are or you want us to be able to contact you, we obviously give us your contact information. So that's where you can submit. And we, thank God, the questions come in week after week, and very interesting ones, very challenging ones, some very provocative ones, and we will do a selection of them right now. Which is, let's begin with what defines morality. I recently had a discussion that left me wondering, this writer writes, what defines morality? Is it determined by an innate human inner compass? Or is it based only on what the Torah tells us? Can we have a code of civility without Torah? Especially considering that history is witness to different cultures independently developing ethical systems. I'd like to believe that all people, even those that are unaware of Torah, have an inherent sense of morality that helps keep society on the right track. Is this indeed the case? Okay, excellent question. And we see this, I'll just broaden the question. You see ideas often that we learn in Chassidus or in Torah in general, and you find them cropping up, or more than just cropping up, in different places in the world, in different cultures, in different philosophies, in different persuasions and schools of thought. So, is it something that we inherently figure out, or is it something that is exclusively given to us by the Torah? But obviously we'll address it in the context of the morality question that was posed. So, let me begin with the following few words, and then I will share with you a letter from the Rebbe that addresses this, among other places where the Rebbe speaks about a similar idea. On one hand, just to broaden the discussion, on one hand, if morality comes from human beings, meaning they figure out what's right and wrong, like the Gemara says, that Ilulei nitna Torah, and the Rebbe Rasha bats Chaz v'Shalom, the Torah was not given, God forbid, we would have learned sneas from a cat, and we would learn other moral behavior and ethical behaviors and decent behavior from different creatures and nature. So there's clearly room to say that there are things people figure out. How to coexist, how to live with each other, how to be in a way that is that we're able to be moral and ethical and sensitive to each other. So clearly that's even without the Torah. The Gemara says it clearly. And yet at the same time we also say that the Torah gave us this civil code and this moral code of ethics that requires us and tells us this is what you should do, this is what you should not do. To the extent, as the Rebbe, this letter points out, which is of course part of many places where the Rebbe says this, why the Torah that said us adibris, on one hand, two key things that we see in the Ten Commandments. On one hand, we see that it's dvarim pshutim. Especially the second half of the Ten Commandments is things that anyone could figure out. Do not steal, do not murder, do not have inappropriate relationships, and things like that. But simple things. On the other hand, we find that the whole Ten Commandments begins with Anochi Hashem Elokech, I am your God. Why do you need God to begin the Ten Commandments with I am your God when these things seemingly could be figured out? Because as the Rebbe indicates here in this letter, and this is a letter in English from the 16th of Shvat Tovshin Chav Daled, 5724, which would be 1964, and speaks specifically about this idea. And essentially is because we see, especially in the last century, we saw that what the Nazis did, they played God, that if you don't have I am your God, the laws of thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal become arbitrary. Everyone decides when and when not. So you need to have an absolute foundation. And yet the Gemara says that with Torah was not given, we'd be able to figure out certain things. The best proof you find is even before Torah, even before Matan Torah, you find that Avram Avinu, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Adam and Chava lived by a moral code. Actually, Nitna Torah, they already were living ethically, and doing so, lasis doka mishpat, not because of a command. So you could say, fine, that Avram was a more sensitive individual, but nevertheless it was not due to a command. So what you learn from this is that that ethics on one hand is something that humans can come to, but yet for it to have really the power, the absolute power, and humans should not become arbitrary and decide when they want to do something, when not, you need the Torah. So how do you explain this in a broader sense? So let me explain it in this context. You may have heard the story, a number of stories they're told about the Beis Yosef. You hear about the Magid of Mezrich, a similar story. That the Talmidim of the Magid, or Talmidim of the Beis Yosef, were once in Beis Medrash with the Magid. Magid was Mechadish, something, a big Chiddush in Gemara. Then after, when the students were all excited about it, such an innovation, a novel approach to learning an idea. Then they each went off to their respective homes and respective cities. One of them went to a shul. In Mincha Ma'ariv, there's a little shir going on. They're relatively anoshim pshutim, relatively simple Jews, but they're learning Gemara. They're learning this Gemara. And he hears the person who's teaching the Gemara, who he knew was not any major scholar, says the Chiddush exactly what the Magid said. So he came back to the Magid very surprised. He says the Chiddush that all of us, and that's with all humility, all of us appreciate it as being a major Chiddush of the Magid. And here a simple Jew said it afterwards without any fanfare, just like almost Pashat. And the Magid answered, and as I said, the story is told similarly in different instances, that once the Lashon of the Zohar, Posach Rab Shimon, the Gemara, it talks, it's Itmar, or it says other Lashanes, but the Zohar is Posach. So Chassidus explains, Posach means, why Posach? Opens up, because it's Posach HaTziner. This teacher, this sage, opens up a new channel with a new idea. He says, once the channel, that Magid explained, is opened up, so Ba'avra Elam, in this atmosphere, in this world, entered this Chiddush, then it makes it much easier for other people to come to it on their own. Had this Chiddush not been introduced into the world, even though consciously these teachers may not have known it, but it exists now. And once it exists, you're capable of being able to appreciate it. So with that, you can understand many different things in life, that even though the actual innovation may have come from one place, it could very well be that a major event like Matan Torah introduced certain principles into this world, as we know from Chassidus, that there was a Gzeira before Matan Torah, Elyenim and Tachtenim were separate. They could not, what was above could not come down below. What was below could not go up above, which meant that matter and spirit had a fundamental schism and split between them. And Matan Torah bridged that split, that even Gashmi, Se'elim, even matter can relate to spirit, to energy. So though it took thousands of years till Einstein came to E equals mc squared, but you can say Matan Torah gave the power and introduced it by Avra Elam, opened up the door. And then different scientists, different thinkers come to it through their processes. Not to take away that credit. Remember, Kol Masha Talmud V'Osel L'Chadosh, we say this even about Torah L'Havdil, that a student that's Mechadesh, a new idea in Torah, Nitn L'Moshe Sinai. It was given to Moshe at Sinai. So you can ask the question, why do you say Chadosh? It's not a Chiddush then. Because the Chiddush is that what was given at Torah may have been a klal, may have been in general terms, or may have been in concealed ways, and he extracted it. So the Rebbe Rashab, in a humorous tone, states in Kuntres Eitz Chaim that there are Chiddushim people say that were not even given to Moshe Sinai. Le nitn leMoshe Sinai, which of course means Chiddushim that are really not worthy of being discussed. So a real creativity and ideas, you'll see, are always based on something that was there before. That's the beauty of it. That it's not original to the point where completely it doesn't have any precedent. It's based, and no one actually saw it until this innovator saw it. That classic joke they tell about the professor who spent half his life writing his magnum opus. He presented it to the wizards of the world, and they all came back with a statement. They said, you know what, your paper was both good and original. The professor was very impressed, very flattered. But then they said, the problem is the part that's good is not original, and the part that's original is not good. So a real Chiddush means it's based on something that was given, but no one yet discovered it. But once it's discovered, then it makes it obviously anyone can come to that idea. So the idea that it exists morality in the world, even though someone may not have learned about it in Torah, is very understandable. In addition to the fact, remember Hashem Echad, there was one God, He created all of reality and implanted the divine truths everywhere, in every stone, in every tree, in every animal, in every creature, everywhere. So if someone observes nature, they will discover godliness in it. And they'll discover wisdom. That's why we say, Chochma bagoyim tamin. Wisdom, even if in the nations of the world you believe that they have. Torah not. Because there are things in Torah that can only be revealed from above. So at the end of the day, there's two components to morality. There's the morality that we human beings come to through our own searching and own seeking, which is lacking one dimension, the absoluteness that comes only from a divine creator, Anechi Hashem Elokecha. So that exists. And then there's the morality when you have the Anechi Hashem Elokecha plus that which you've come to. Then, of course, you have the biggest power of all. That's why, for example, by a bris, even though the Rambam says in Pirush HaMishnayos and Chulin that we don't circumcise a child because Avram Avinu did it, we do it because Matan Torah said it's a mitzvah, but we still say Brisa Shel Avram Avinu. Why? Because you have both milas. You have the mila of what Avram was able to accomplish, even though there was a mitzvah to him. But talk about the morality or the tzedakah mishpat or the chesed of Avram, even though it was not a mitzvah ve'esa, meaning that he was commanded to do so as was commanded after Matan Torah, but he did so. So we have it both in our personality, based on being children of Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, plus the command of God. So you have both powers, which explains why the Gemara sometimes says, what's greater, mitzvah ve'esa, if you're commanded to do it, or not to, or you do it even if you're not commanded. So on one hand, commanded to do it is greater because you're fulfilling a divine command. But on the other hand, if you do it at your own initiative, it has a greater element that it came from you. So it's more personal and more internalized. And if you have both, then you have the ultimate. So essentially that's the answer. True, ultimate, absolute morality, you need the Torah, because or else human beings, due to their subjective nature or even our limited wisdom, cannot always figure out what is moral in every given sense of the word. And even when we have the Torah, we have disagreements in some of the interpretations. So that's why you need to have the Torah. On the other hand, that doesn't mean we are human beings that can't figure out things and we can't come to, by learning from nature, from the cat, tznius, and so on, certain things as well. And the Gemara tells us that even though the Torah was given and tells us about tznius, it still tells us that we're not for the Torah, we would learn it from the cat, which tells us that in nature you also have embedded these Torah principles. So it's really a combination and more complicated than just a black and white answer in this discussion. Okay. If anybody wants this letter, by the way, in case you don't have it, the 16th of Shvat of 5724, we will be happy. Just email us, but we need your email address for this, and we'll respond and we'll send it to you. Okay, next question. Why is organ donation prohibited when we are taught to love and help another? Yeah. Why isn't organ donation allowed in Jewish law? Since Avos Yisrael is the foundational principle of the entire Torah, why shouldn't we have the seemingly love for another by helping them posthumously with an organ they need? It seems to run contrary to what we've conditioned to do since young, namely helping someone else even at the expense of ourselves. So here too, I want to cite a letter from the Rebbe in English as well. This is from the 26th of Nisan, Tafshin Chavtes 5729. That would be 1969. The Rebbe writes, with regard to the question of leaving one's eyes to an eye bank after 120 years, or similar bequests, I am of course reluctant to discuss this subject since this whole matter is of no immediate concern to you at all, inasmuch as you have many, many years to live and to fill them with productive and joyful activities, etc. However, since you have already raised this question, and in view of the fact that there are various misconceptions, I'm reading literally from this letter, about it, there are various misconceptions about it, which have gained currency, I cannot pass over this question without telling you that there is a clear and distinct psak din, a ruling, a halachic ruling, which leaves no doubt as to what the position of our Holy Torah and religion is in regard to this matter. It is that not only is the neshama, meaning part of God, verily a part of godliness above, in the words of the Tanya, but also the body of a Jew is sacred and is the property of God, while the Jew is no more than a guardian of it. This position explains also many dinim rules relating to the body having to do with hygiene and the like, which, are also part of our Torah. Thus, the halacha rules explicitly that one must not mutilate, God forbid, something which belongs to God, and which has been placed in the care of a person as guardian and keeper. For the same reason, our sages of blessed memory have been so strict in the matter of mutilating dead bodies. In those exceptional cases which are very rare, underline very, where an exception was made to the rule, it is because of special reasons, which in no way diminishes the sanctity and inviolability of the body as God's property, but only because under special circumstances God himself has permitted certain isolated exceptions, in which case it is the owner's will that is being carried out, namely God's will. Okay, then the Rebbe goes on to talk about a different subject matter. Okay, it still doesn't answer the question seemingly about Avos Yisrael, or Ava in general. So why doesn't it make sense if a person passes away that someone else needs, let's say, eyes, in this case, or another organ transplant, that you are now giving it to them? But the truth is, if you read the letter closely, it does answer the question. God is the one that told us to be kind to each other. God is the one that told us not to mutilate or in any way to deface a body that belongs to him. So there's no way that the Torah's Chesed, the kind Torah, and a Torah that was given to bring peace to this world, and a Torah exactly as you write, based on love, that God would tell us to do something in any way that's destructive. She'll say, one second, but my logic states that helping someone else after my passing, God forbid after 120 years, is a good thing to do. Well, here it goes back to what I said before. Who decides what's morality? It may sound logical to you, but maybe there are other factors that you don't understand. Even if there are no factors that you don't understand, this is what God says. Perhaps the preservation of the sanctity of the body is part of the sanctity of life in general, and which makes us all more refined and more giving type of people. And even though it may make sense to us, not everything that makes sense is necessarily the right thing, as we discussed a moment before about morality. In addition to the fact that, as he said, the Rebbe says in this letter, there are exceptions. One of the exceptions would probably be pekuach nefesh. If literally a person's life will be saved, we know that we even desecrate Yom Kippur. But just out of kindness, or just because we think this is the right kind thing to do, that's not sufficient, because the sanctity of the human body is the sanctity of God's presence in our lives. And that is as important as anything else. So this is not a cruel thing, God forbid. This is kindness. And you have to think about why this is kind. Just like many things that the Torah tells us is kind and the right thing to do, even though we may come up with a different thought or idea. So that's the brief response to this question. And as I said, if you have further questions, please submit them. But let's move to the next topic. How to distinguish between pure faith and meshugas. Okay. How can we distinguish between the super-rational and the irrational? Between behavior driven by pure faith or one driven by meshugas? With so much extremism surrounding us, how can we know if something is coming from shtus de kedusha or shtus de lumazeh? Those are terms that you may be familiar with from the Maimer Basel Ligani Tovshin Yud. Shtus de kedusha means a super-rational type of insanity that goes beyond the rational. Example of exuberant dancing by a wedding, as he brings there, and other things of similar nature. Or shtus de lumazeh, which is insanity that's irrational and just pure nonsense, or worse than nonsense. So how do we distinguish? On the surface level, they may both appear the same. So what criteria can help us determine which is holy and which is crazy? Very good question. And here too, besides our own logic, we also need the Torah to tell us. That's why we have a Torah. The Torah tells us, Tamim tiyim Hashem alekecha, be wholesome, be straight with your God. And don't do things that are weird or strange. Which is why many things that may even have some value, you have to always walk the straight path and not look for any extreme situations unless it's absolutely ordered to do so. You have times in the Torah tells us to behave that way. Ein semchen ala nes. We don't rely on miracles. And if God wants to send a miracle, he'll send a miracle. But you can't build your life and make a plan based on it. So the Torah tells us the rational, God blessed us with a mind, with a heart, with feelings, with intelligence, with maturity, to determine how to behave in every given circumstance. And even when Hashem sends Hatzalah to help us, He often does so through the garments of nature, and we have to be wise to appreciate it. So that's a general Torah approach. So any type of abnormal that is not what's called, when I say word normal, quote unquote normal, I mean normal based on the parameters that God put into the existence and that the Torah specifies. Anything that that seems to be outside of that, you need to have a very strong case to demonstrate that it's holy, because it's very likely that it could be based on things that are not holy. So basically, the standards and the status quo is the normal, the normative approach, which is, as the Rambam says, the derech mitzvah, the middle road, which is not depending on miracles, not depending on other things that are beyond us, even though we know that nature itself is also beyond nature. That's why it says, "Hamayim b'chei elamim v'zereya." That say the Zerayim is connected to Hayamuna Sitach Amuna. What is planting a field is Amuna? It's not based on faith. It's nature. But nature itself is based on faith. And that's why Rabbi Yain Saba and others, before they meet, even though they had the meal in front of them, they still would pray for the meal. Because everything, even Teva, is L'maylam and Teva. But it's Teva within, it's L'maylam and Teva within Teva. As I said, you don't rely on miracles. And you try to do everything possible in our normal, quote-unquote, intelligent. Now, normal, someone will say, 1 second. Normal does not mean social mores. Does not mean cultural mores. That's not necessarily normal. That's just because a lot of people are doing it. That doesn't make it normal. Normal means the standards that Torah has established. Normal means the standard that nature has established. And I mean inherent in nature. Not something that a bunch of people came up with and they say that's what's normal now. Because yesterday's crazy could be today's normal. And many people will come up with all kinds of things. Let's go back to the morality discussion. What was moral, what is not moral, what was moral many years ago is today immoral. And things change, and they're arbitrary based on human interpretation. So when you say normal, that's why there's a Torah, that's why there's halacha, that's why there are rabbanim and mashpiyim, that you ask, what is the approach? And the approach is always to take the derech, the direct approach. We have statements not necessarily comparing the two. L'chatchila riber is an attitude, as the Rebbe says, that you could take two approaches, one going conventional and one going above. But even that, the Rebbe says, in kelim de tikkun. It is the teyu and kelim de tikkun. Even that has a certain matter of order. However, you're going not just to conventional, you're going with a certain positive, with a certain approach to l'chatchila. Initially, you go above, which means you don't necessarily have to maneuver your way through. But that also doesn't mean crazy. So when you talk about the idea of what distinguishes between the two, as I said, the standard is what the Torah establishes, and everything else needs you to make a case for it. Purim, it says, Purim is a tzivui, it's a command. Simchas Torah, there's certain things that are told to us, and so on. Now, how could you actually determine when you see extremism? Well, there's a few ways you determine. First of all, where does it come from? Is the extremism coming because Hashem said so in the Torah, and this person is completely committed and doesn't care and is fearless? Or is it coming because that person happens to be an extremist and their personality is one of extremism? Sometimes extremism can come from desperation. Sometimes extremism can come from fanaticism that's completely not grounded. That's why in Judaism we have to be extremely careful. Pinchas was a kanoi, but it's a very rare instance, and his personality was absolutely the opposite, interestingly. That's why the Bris Yishalim is given a covenant of peace, even though he behaved in like a zealot. So you have to be very careful when it comes to this, and we have to look at something. Other criteria, in addition, where does it come from? Where does it originate from? Is also, what is the end result? If the end result is machlekes, war, like the Rebbe says always, the teitzos, that it creates divisiveness, it creates dissent, it creates destruction, you can rest assured it's not coming from Kedusha. Because Kedusha has bittul in it, which leads to the next criteria. Is it coming from humility and selflessness, or this is coming from a very strong position which has no flexibility? And that you could also tell. There's no flexibility, that's not me, Hashem says so. But you see that the person is not invested in it. When you see inflexibility, you have to always be wary. Why is it so inflexible? Maybe there's an exception here. Maybe how you're so sure. So there's many criteria that you can determine, and if you can't do it yourself, sometimes you have to talk to other people who are more trained, more experienced, to determine what is not. Now, is it sometimes hard to establish? Yes, of course. First of all, there are people who are very good con artists. They're manipulative people who can dress up and sound mamish like Kedusha mamish, and you find out the whole thing is not based on that at all. That's why it's important, you consult, but don't jump. Remember, always better to be err on the side of caution when it comes to kanois, when it comes to extremism. That's the Torah approach. If you establish absolutely, then it's another story. In addition, I go back again, this is not taking away from passion and intensity of Shtuz de Kedusha. Obviously, there's a certain element of Mesiras Nefesh that goes into what a Jew does, even in basic mitzvahs, even things that are not necessarily life-threatening. But that has to be that. But that's coming from utter bittul, utter commitment, not because you happen to be a person who goes to extremes. So that's what we have to be looking for. So there's definitely a Mesiras Nefesh element that we have to have in a commitment that goes super rational in all things we do. We're not basically only rational, but the rational is are only rational human beings. But the rational is also created by God. The mind, Chabad, and Chagas, to be monitors, to be measures, to be filters, to be gauges that determine whether this thing is the proper thing or not. That's why you have to look in the Torah, you have to ask Mashpim, you have to ask others. So you have to use the mind to determine, in case make sure we don't get into a situation where we're justifying behavior that's not acceptable under the guise that this is a super rational instead of irrational behavior. Okay. Next question. What is my role as a step-parent? Okay. Hi, Rabbi Jacobson. First, I would like to thank you for your informative and entertaining weekly videocasts. They bring a lot of light and guidance into my life, and I often share the messages with others. Did the Rebbe ever write or give guidance about the role of a step-parent in a child's life? I ask because I have 3 beautiful stepchildren. The 2 younger ones are truly amazing, but the oldest seems to have really inherited his father's personality. He's 14 years old and lazy, stubborn, often very argumentative. Despite being very smart and naturally gifted, he often is too lazy to do things that are in his own best interest, whether regarding his health, academics, or otherwise. Despite asking him, he does the bare minimum to contribute to the household welfare, such as cleaning up after himself, etc. While I'm sure many teenage boys act that way, I'm asking specifically what the role of a step-parent, in this case me as a stepfather, should be. Without meaning to sound haughty, I think I can honestly say I was nothing like him as a teenager. I worked very hard in school, helped around the house, and was amenable to my parents' requests. Maybe that is part of the reason I'm so confounded with dealing with him. Thanks so much for all you do for our community. Okay, it's a very good question, and one that requires, as usual, case-by-case analysis, because there are many details that I would be asking you if we were speaking face-to-face or on the phone, which includes more factors of perhaps why he's acting out that way. Look, at the end of the day, in the healthiest situation, and God should bless us all to have that, an intact family, a father and mother, without a death and divorce, God forbid, which the natural biological parents, even then we all know bringing up children is very challenging. When you get into the situation with a step-parent, even the best step-parent, at the end of the day, this for the child is not their biological parent. And different children of different ages adapt differently. And even of the same age may adapt differently. So we have to be very sensitive here, not to, even if everything you're writing is correct about this teenager, for all you know, he's very angry about why he doesn't have his father with him, whatever the reason is. And he may be acting out, and you may be becoming the scapegoat and the punching bag because you are the person that's so-called filling the shoes of becoming the husband to his mother and not his biological father. So therefore, that would make it more difficult for you to address it directly because you, in his eyes, are somewhat of an enemy. I'm not putting words in anyone's mouth, and I'm not suggesting this is the case, but it could be the case. And therefore, you need outside help to be able to determine this, someone that this boy can speak to. The last thing you want is a head-on confrontation with him, making him have to choose between you being the husband of your wife and his mother. You don't want to do that. So I think in a situation like this, I'm glad the other kids are amazing and everything is going well. But in a situation like this, my first piece of advice would be is you do not engage with him and don't take the bait, so to speak. It's not tit for tat. You're not equals. You're an adult. He's a child. It would be wise to talk to his mother about it. It would be wise to help get other people help. And you have to stay neutral or do what you're told to do in order to make this better. For you to become the disciplinarian and be the one that's going to fix him, or so to speak, address it, and the way you're describing it, even if it's all true, you're not the person to do it, because it's not going to create better goodwill. It'll just create bad blood. Now, if you're the natural parent, even then if you have a rebellious child, you also have to be careful at a certain age. But then it's a different circumstance, which we're not addressing. But with this additional component, it definitely makes the situation a little more volatile and more sensitive. So I hope you take what I'm saying with the good intention it's meant. It's not at all a critique of yourself, the stepfather writing this. It's really just looking at it with objective eyes. Now, with that help from outside party, they may advise what you should do, what yes to do, what not to do. And at the end of the day, it's never going to be the best case scenario. I know scenarios where step-parents become a major nightmare in the family. The children reject them, or some of the children reject them, and it creates battles that the mother has to choose between the child and the husband. And the husband sometimes insists, or the step-parent sometimes insists, choose, which is or never good, because you're forcing a situation that is untenable. How can that mother-child, she loves, let's say, a mother or father, how could the natural parent be forced to choose between the step-parent and their children? So you have to, if you're a Chassidic person, if you're a person with bittul and a person who's looking for the best, you have to think about this and care about it and know this. There are challenging times and you may have to step back and create certain guidelines. Even in the best case scenario, where it's all in, the transition is smooth, where there's the support, where people wisely set things up in a way where the children know this is a step-parent and yet there's mutual respect, and no one's thinking the step-parent is trying to replace my natural parent. And again, this is whether divorce or death. Then, even then, it's not a perfect situation. But as I said again, even a natural parent, nothing's perfect. But in all situations, God does not give us challenges we cannot overcome. This is a challenge, and with the right advice, with the right counsel, with the right humility and wise discretion, there's no question you can improve the situation tremendously and end up helping yourself as the step-parent and helping this child as well, as he grows into an adult. And if you really care for him and care for the family and care for your wife, this is what you should be doing in creating a situation where you get the right advice and the right counsel on this matter. Okay. Now let us do a little follow-up, and we'll do the Chassidus question. Moving right along here. Meditation. Someone wrote about episode 104. Hi, Rabbi. Do you have a method of meditation on your website to practice? Thank you. I don't know if it's related to a particular episode. I see what it is. In episode 104, I discussed the topic of meditation in the context of Torah. In Torah, they have the expression hisbonenus, which is a form of contemplation. I discussed at length that there is the concept. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan has books on the Torah, Kabbalah and meditation, Torah and meditation, and different type of meditations. But in the tradition that I grew up in, which is Chassidus, especially Chassidus Chabad, there's hisbonenus, there's contemplation, cognitive presence, and there's emotional contemplation, intellectual contemplation, how to creating the space before davening, primarily, and also during learning. So I would refer you to episode 104 and refer you that the meditations that are often out there that people use, they may have some legitimacy, but if you want to go on the Eisen Brick, on the iron bridge that the Rabbeim gave us, they gave us methods of hisbonenus, of contemplation, which is usually contemplation either in Pirush HaMilis, in the meaning of the Tfilis, contemplation on Seder Ishtalshelus, on the structure of the way God created the world and how we travel through them in our own sublimation as we climb the ladder of prayer to connect to the divine. So I refer you to that, and that will be that. There was a follow-up to the discussion we had about hitting children last week. Someone writes, why is it even posed as a question? It's always wrong. If a child is running into the street, is it still not okay? Another person writes. So I just want to quickly comment on that. It's talked about because the Pasuk says it. As I quoted, the Pasuk says, Shevet. The using, sparing the rod can be the enemy, your enemy of your child. So the Pasuk seems to suggest it, and you see customs throughout history that were teachers, the parents, that actually exercised it. And there are places in the Gemara that talks about it as well. Makal Ritzua, Yiras HaRitzua, etc. So that's why we addressed it. The fact that so you need to understand, always wrong, not necessarily always in history, definitely today. As far as child running to the street is still not okay. As I said, is hitting the best way to discipline a child? According to the Rebbe, according to the Rabbeim, it's not. So there are many ways to get across and to discipline a child, and we discussed that last week, which I don't have to go over again. One more follow-up was about the Chassidus question last week, so it's a little esoteric. Talked about the Olam Hamalbish, or Hamalbush. Different ways it's expressed. And the Rebbe Rashab uses Malbish a lot. Another place is Malbush. As I explained, this is an idea that comes from Rabbi Yisrael Saruk's Kabbalah. I cited a number of places. Chassidus, I gave the sources last week. The questioner asks, is the Malbish before the Tzimtzum or after the Tzimtzum? It wasn't quite clear from your discussion. So if you followed the discussion about the Shimu, which really was the springboard that led to this discussion on Malbush, we learned that there is places in Kabbalah that clearly states, or at least appears from there, that the Malbush is before the Tzimtzum. And the Rebbe seems to lean like that in his footnote in the Maimer HaCholzu, Tafresh Nun Tes, which I discussed at length, about the Tzimtzum Ribua before the Tzimtzum of Igul, the squared Tzimtzum before the circled Tzimtzum. And the squared Tzimtzum is the Malbush. That's why the Malbush is a Lavush of Reish Lamed Aleph Sha'arim. However, in other places, when you look, especially in the Rebbe Rashab's Mamorim, the ones I quoted last week, Anoichi Tofresh Nun Aleph, and Kol Hanena Tofresh Nun Beis, there it's clearly after the Tzimtzum. And he says, when he discusses there, Yud Kei Vav Kei, so on many levels. So he starts with Yud Kei Vav Kei in the Seder Shtalshus. Then he says, Yesh Leimer, there's Yud Kei Vav Kei also in the Seder is Galus HaKav. What? The first is the Nekudus HaRishimu, which is the point like a Yud that remains after the Tzimtzum addition, which is the impression. Then comes the Kav, is the Vav. Then comes the He'achrein, is the Vav, as the Kav creates Seder Shtalshus, is the structure. But then the question, what's the He'deshena? Remember, there's Yud Kei Vav Kei. So he says the He'deshena, Yesh Leimer, is the Malbush, Elam HaMalbush. Which follows, he says, the Rishimu. So that clearly is after the Tzimtzum. And in other places, the Rebbe Rashab makes it very clear, the Reish Lamed Aleph Sha'arim, which are the gates of the 231 permutations of Al-Bam, and how the letters of the Aleph Beis go with Aleph to Lamed, and Beis Mem, Gimel Nun, and so on. But then it goes also Ponim and Ochir, that's straight, and then backwards would be Tov Lamed, and so on. So he says there that that's after the Tzimtzum. So the Malbush, according to Rebbe Rashab, and the oral places I've seen is after the Tzimtzum, and this also consistent with the Ribua and the square being after the Tzimtzum. But when you look in one of the sources, both in Emek HaMelech and Migdash Melech, there clearly, and I'm looking at it right now inside, it appears, when you read it simply, the simple pshat, it appears that the Malbush is before the Tzimtzum Harishon. Because he says, Kisharatza Insa Baruchu, the Eibishter wanted to reveal himself and to do good. What did he do? He asalei levush. He made himself a garment me'er atzmusei, from the air of atzmusei, from the core energy in air. Shehi hateira. Shehi bnuya mereish lamed aleph sha'arim ponim mereish lamed aleph acher kadein kamtza de levushe menei obey. So from there it appears very clearly that the Eibishter, like oita er kasalma, he wrapped himself up in the air like a levush. And then afterwards he says, he so-called concealed himself in his garment. And then afterwards, clearly stating that the mokum chol upone came afterwards. Additionally, the Rebbe actually says the mokum chol upone, even afterwards, is still the square one, that is still not the tzimtzum that we know, the tzimtzum of Igul, which comes afterwards. So from here it appears that the levush, the malbush, is before the tzimtzum. But I explained when we discussed the Rishim, it's not a contradiction, because you could say on that these levels repeat themselves in different dimensions. There's the ribua, the square that comes before the circle. There's the circle. There's the square that comes after the circle. There's the garment as it comes, as God envisions the structure of existence, which would be the Malbush Lifnei Tzimtzum. And even the Rebbe Rashab uses the word Shir Atzme B'Keich, even though there he talks about it after the Tzimtzum. And it speaks about Tehiri Allah after the Tzimtzum. But there are places Chassidus says Tehiri Allah is before the Tzimtzum. It says, B'Reish Menusa de Malka, in the beginning when God chose and gave Rishus to reign, is Golev Galufu B'Tehiri Allah. He engraved something Tehiri Allah. So some places Tehiri Allah refers to after the Tzimtzum. But the Rebbe says in those footnotes in Tafresh and Ranat, in the Cholzu, that many places Chassidus talks Tehiri Allah, as we all know, Lifnei Tzimtzum. Those are the Asius of Rishimu before the Tzimtzum. And after the Tzimtzum, the Rishimu, the impression remains from them. Where the light is, the infinite light is withdrawn or concealed. So you see clearly that the same idea can be in different levels. And therefore it's not a contradiction. So in concept you could say, in theory, God saved Maisa Machshava Tchila, that there's the Chodesh HaKelim or the Chodesh HaLevushim, the Chodesh HaEsius, Lifnei Tzimtzum. And then there's the way it manifests in actuality that comes after the Tzimtzum, which is where the Malbush, as the way the Rebbe Rashab explains it in the Maimorim of Nun Aleph and Nun Beis, Anechi Nun Aleph and Kol Anen and Nun Beis. Okay, all this is esoteric. What it means in simple, what's the nafkamina in Chassidus applied to our lives? The bottom line is, as I said in the beginning of the discussion, the Kalim, the Asius, are rooted in the highest levels. And even after the Tzimtzum and all concealments, they remain intact. Lei noga b'hamat Tzimtzum, as I mentioned before. So it's relevant to us because however you look at it, the Malbush, which adds the dimension of the potential of spheres, the potential that would come later, because remember, until the Kav, you don't have it revealed, that it's all there before, which means when we connect from in our work down here below, we can connect to those highest of levels, because at the end of the day, the Tzimtzum did not remove them all. They just remain concealed and accessible to us, which has many implications in psychological terms of the hope and the ability to know that nothing is broken in life. There's no Tzimtzum that breaks us. Layers can be concealed. Layers can be compromised. But at the core, there's something waiting for us. And if we access it, we can reach the highest levels and reconnect. So it's a tremendous tool in growth and healing. Okay, the Chassidus question of this week. So we're moving to a new question, and that is the following. I found that some sources of Chassidus attribute different levels to infinity. How can we say that, which is called dargas and bli gvul? How can we say that there are levels to infinity? Doesn't the Tzemach Tzedek and Sefer HaChakira say the opposite? Another person writes, are you aware of sources of Chassidus and from the Rebbe the idea that the various levels of infinity, Nekud, Kav, Shetach? If so, would you send me a link, please? It would touch a chord with one of my Yidden who enjoys mathematics and is getting involved in Chassidus. Much thanks, huge kudos for your amazing work all around. Okay, so yes, indeed, I will give you some sources. The Rebbe, even though in Chassidus itself you don't find much discussion about Dargis and Bli Gvul, as a matter of fact, as quoted here, the Sefer HaChakira makes a case that you could argue the opposite. He says that one of the reasons that the world has to have a beginning is because there are no Dargis and Bli Gvul. Gvul, as many Gvulim can never lead to Bli Gvul. So that means since the world is made up of finite time and finite space, you have to say finite generations, there's a beginning. And when it comes to the question, what about maybe there's levels, maybe it's Bli Gvul and Bli Gvul go for their levels, he negates that seemingly. Yet the Rebbe in a number of sikhs, and I'm going to tell you exactly which, at least some that I collected together, does say clearly Dargis and Bli Gvul, and speaks about it actually in Aveda. That the Bli Gvul of our work, even if you've done Bli Gvul, you can still do another higher level of Bli Gvul. And uses indeed this example of Nekud Kav Shetach, which I will explain in a moment. Let me first give you the sources. So if you want to write them down, you can write them down, or you can listen to this again slowly. Leil Simchas Teda Tavshin Yud Gimel, Yud Shvat Tavshin Yud Daled, Shabbos Parsha Matis Masei Tavshin Tezayin, okay, Shabbos Parsha Truma Tavshin Mem Gimel, Shabbos Parsha Shmini Tavshin Mem Gimel, Shabbos Parsha Bereishi is the second Fabrengen Tavshin Daled Mem, Purim Cotton Tavshin Mem Vov, Leil Hey Tevis Tavshin Mem Tes, the Maimer Ilamasei Tavshin Mem Vov, and Shabbos Parsha Kisove Tavshin Mem Ches, which is printed Muge, page 639. Good. There in Tavshim Mem Ches, and also in Truma, and I believe in one or two other places, the Rebbe brings the example. He says to make it more palatable, he brings the example, a mathematical example. In mathematics, if you study geometry, you know there's a point, and there's a line, and there's a plane. A point, of course, is a point. A line has length, but no width or depth. And a plane has length and width. And of course, then there's also a cube, which has also depth in that sense. So here you go. In mathematics, it says the point does not occupy space. The fact that we make a point and you can measure it is only because it makes it easier for us to relate to. But the conceptual point in mathematics has no space. That's why there are infinite points in a line. Now, how could there be infinite points? A line, let's say, is an inch or 5 inches or 20 inches. Infinite points because the point does not occupy space. So there you have infinity. Now, what about a plane? We have many lines. And each line has infinite points. So you have to say in that plane, you have infinite lines, which is a greater level of bli gvul and infinity than the line itself. Because one line is infinite points. Many lines is infinite points. And then if you add depth to it and you have actually a cube, a square, then you also have a third level, not just the line and not just the many lines, but now you have also the width and the depth that also create another level of bli gvul. You can see in the footnote there in Tavshim Mem Ches, Chelik Beis, Sefer HaSichos, page 639. Now, in Aveda, the Rebbe explains, as I said, it means that every level of bli gvul, even if you've gone there, it's always more bli gvul. You could ask the question, has anyone ever reached bli gvul? But conceptually, yes. The Rebbe speaks about conceptual space and time there as well. Now, the question then is, what about what the Sefer HaKira says? So there's a letter from the Rebbe, Tovshin Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Menachemov. I'm citing it from the Likutei Sichos Chelik Chof, the bottom of page 545, where the Rebbe makes it very clear that there are levels, and he disagrees with the writer that bli gvul to gvul is not echus, it's a kamozdika thing, and he says there are levels. He says, it says in Sefer HaKira, he says the Sefer HaKira refers to Keich HaNivroim. By us, we can't have levels in bli gvul. But the Keich HaBeira, there is possible to have that, as he says there, and he actually cites that the Sefer HaKira says one place in Sefer HaKira, seemingly the Tzemach Tzedek reverses himself from another opinion earlier, which you can look up there in this letter. So bottom line is, I hope that covers it somewhat, that there are levels, and these are the sources. Okay. With that, let us move to the essays of this week. Now, we are winding down, we're now in the final round of the last 30 essays being judged now and evaluated by the judges. So you will be shortly hearing from us an announcement of the winners. We're excited about that. Excellent essays. But we're still reading and reviewing some of the essays from the previous essay contest, which, as I said, it keeps on coming. There's so many, and beautiful. What can I say? So the 3 essays today, the first one we've been dealing with is combating low self-esteem. Combating low self-esteem with a royal attitude by Yael Rosenberger, Chabad Girls Academy, a teacher in Brooklyn, New York. Here she goes through Friedrich Bresmeimer, Teiv Li Teres Picha, Ma'alfe Zov V'Kesef, and explains the concept of Malchus. How Malchus, by understanding and cultivating the Malchus within us, we can actually cultivate a deep self-esteem. Speaks specifically about feminine royalty, because Malchus is associated with the Nekeva, with the Nekeva, with Malchus, and how it's a feminine attribute, and that attribute helps us discover that dignity is something internal, as opposed to something aggressive and external. And a very well written and done essay, so I commend you for that. That's essay number 1. Essay number 2 that we're covering today is The Power of Inclusion by Yenis and Bites, 61 years old, Koilel Betar Eliat in Israel. So, of course, people want to be included. Everybody has the basic desire to be included. This desire, given to us by our Creator, has been embedded in our psyches, but it is all too elusive, and its process vaporizes before our very eyes. We see educational systems and classrooms struggling with cohesiveness among diverse populations. And he goes on to speak about inclusion and its virtues. He says, this following article will show that by understanding the practical application of a Chassidic principle, it will ultimately promote lasting attachment, bringing solidarity to the person, enlivened community teamwork, and cohesiveness to nations. For a deeper understanding of this Chassidic principle, koyach hapayel benifel, the cause of all is inextricably within the first effect, we need to take note of the inner workings of this unifying force. And goes on to explain the idea of how God applies himself to creation, quoting the Mittel Rebbe, as explained by Olam Hamalbish. The source is on Shari Yichud, the bir of Hillel on Shari Yichud of the Mittel Rebbe. And in a detailed way, explains in a rational fashion how that force defines existence. And that when you look at the different forces of kindness and discipline, you can find the ability to find the balance and the unity that includes inclusion as well as having the right boundaries and borders in place. He quotes the Alter Rebbe quoting the Magid about loving your fellow as yourself, and that being an exposition of the idea of loving God. So essentially this is also not just inclusion among us, it's also how we connect with God and having both a certain individuality, at the same time an acceptance. And then he goes on with a practical application based on Mittel Rebbe, explained by Hillel Parish, that involves 5 steps: acknowledgement, understanding, picturing, gazing, and intending. So a very well done essay, I must say, and to my point of view, it should have been in the top. Maybe it wasn't the top, so I recommend to be read by all. And as this and the other essays can be found at meaningfullife.com/MyLife/essays-2016. Finally, the third essay is Reaching Beyond the Work-Life Balance by Miriam Metzinger, age 45, freelance writer, Jerusalem, Israel. The work-life balance, she writes, is often held up as a kind of golden mean that represents the optimal management of various aspects of one's day-to-day reality. It involves devoting a fair amount of one's time and energy to the home, work, and to oneself in an effort to create peace and order in one's life. Focusing on the work-life balance can lead to creating boundaries and losing sight of an overarching unifying purpose. In Chassidic thought, the purpose of creation is the geula, or the redemption of the world, and the sages teach that a major way to achieve this is through tzedakah or giving charity. This essay deals with ways in which the concept of tzedakah unifies the aspect of one's life and can provide a model for achieving balance. And goes on to speak about how pursuing work-life balance cuts us off from our real purpose, and how tzedakah realigns that purpose. And with many practical examples, using Avram Avinu as divine energy in action, man of chesed and tzedakah, and ultimately bringing to revelation and unity where we marry life's details to meaning and purpose. And how tzedakah serves a central role in doing that, and obviously leading to the geula. So again, a very practical application of a concept in Chassidus, as is, of course, the criteria for these essays. And with that, we conclude. I want to wish everyone a very freilich and Chodesh Nisan, a geula dika month, a geula, not just a geula, but Nisan nigalu, but Nisan asidin ligoel, the geula amitis v'ashlema, the Ayidei Mashiach Tzidkenu. And the month, of course, the month that we celebrate and we honor the Beis Nisan, leading all to Yud Aleph Nisan, leading to, as I said, to the Gula Amitzis V'Ashlema. And we talked before about Nisiyas, the Nitzchis of Nisiyas. May that manifest in our lives by us doing our part in perpetuating and demonstrating its Nitzchis through our work, where we continue the work without unwaveringly, without any setback, without any retreat. And on the contrary, only Mailim B'Kodesh from one level of Bligvul to another level of Bligvul. And a good Chodesh. And until next Sunday, please be well. Next Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. with MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 157. Have a very good Chodesh and a good week.